Walk through almost any major Canadian city today, and you might think you've suddenly landed in India. Entire neighborhoods, shopping malls, colleges, restaurants, even job markets have changed dramatically over the past few years. But how did this happen? Why are millions of Indians choosing Canada over every other country? And why are more and more Canadians saying their country has changed forever? When many people walk through the streets of cities like Toronto, Vancouver, or Calgary and notice the growing number of immigrants, especially those from India, they often come to the same conclusion. This happened because Canada simply decided to open its borders. But that idea is far from reality. What few people realize is that this transformation began long before and was driven by a silent problem that threatens nearly every developed country. The truth is, Canada did not welcome hundreds of thousands of new residents simply because of a political decision. In many ways, the country believed it had to do so to secure its own future. While the world's population continues to grow, Canada faces a completely different reality. The country has one of the lowest birth rates among the world's major economies. For decades, Canadians have been having fewer and fewer children, creating a chain reaction that affects every part of society. Fewer children today means fewer workers tomorrow. And when the next generation is not large enough to replace those leaving the workforce, the entire economic system begins to feel the consequences. At the same time that fewer people are being born, millions of Canadians from the so-called baby boomer generation are reaching retirement age. These are experienced workers leaving hospitals, schools, factories, technology companies, transportation firms, and nearly every sector of the economy. The problem is that there simply are not enough young Canadians to fill those positions. Gradually, the country began facing a labor shortage that threatened to slow economic growth and put essential services at risk. This challenge goes far beyond simply finding people to work. A modern economy depends on millions of active taxpayers to fund public healthcare, schools, infrastructure, and most importantly, the pension system. As more people retire and receive benefits while fewer workers continue paying into the system, the financial balance becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. In other words, without a growing working-age population, the cost of maintaining Canada's standard of living rises rapidly. That is exactly why immigration stopped being viewed as merely a social policy and became a long-term economic strategy. For decades, successive governments, regardless of political party, invested in programs that made it easier for skilled workers, international students, and specialized professionals to move to Canada. The idea was relatively straightforward. Bring in people of working age who could find jobs, spend money, start businesses, pay taxes, and help support an increasingly aging population. In practice, this meant filling positions that local workers could no longer cover. Hospitals needed nurses and doctors. Technology companies were looking for engineers and software developers. The construction industry required more workers to keep up with the growth of Canadian cities. Restaurants, supermarkets, hotels, transportation companies, and many other industries also struggled to hire enough employees. In many cases, there simply were not enough Canadian applicants to meet the demand. It was under these circumstances that Canada began setting ambitious immigration targets, welcoming hundreds of thousands of new permanent residents every year. The goal was not only to increase the population, but also to renew the workforce and keep the economy running during a period of profound demographic change. According to many experts, this strategy helped Canada continue growing, while other developed nations faced many of the same demographic challenges. If Canada desperately needed workers, one inevitable question arises. Why were Indians, in particular, the ones who came to represent such a significant share of this new wave of immigration? After all, there are dozens of countries with millions of people searching for a better life. So why did India become, by far, Canada's largest source of immigrants? The answer is not a single factor, but rather a combination of circumstances that turned this into one of the largest migration movements between two countries in recent history. It all begins with one remarkable fact. India is now the most populous country in the world, and also has one of the youngest populations on the planet. More than half of its people are under the age of 30. That means that every year, millions of young adults enter the job market at almost the same time, creating an enormous pool of professionals all searching for their first major opportunity. At first glance, this might seem like a tremendous advantage for India's economy, and in many ways, it is. The country has been growing rapidly and has established itself as one of the world's largest economies. The challenge, however, is that the workforce is expanding even faster than the number of high-quality jobs being created. As a result, competition has become incredibly intense, with millions of people fighting for the same opportunities. In some fields, the level of competition is almost unimaginable. Government recruitment exams often attract hundreds of thousands of applicants for only a handful of positions. Private companies may interview thousands of candidates to hire just a few dozen employees. Landing a good job is not simply a matter of talent or hard work. It often requires years of preparation, additional qualifications, and constant competition against other highly skilled candidates. This has created a fascinating paradox. Every year, Indian universities graduate enormous numbers of engineers, technology professionals, business graduates, pharmacists, and specialists across countless industries. India is internationally recognized for producing highly qualified professionals, particularly in engineering and information technology. Yet not all of them are able to find positions that match their education and skills. That is exactly where countries like Canada come into the picture. For a young Indian professional, the opportunity to work in a developed economy, earn significantly higher wages, achieve financial stability, and follow a clear pathway toward permanent residency is incredibly appealing. In many cases, the salary difference between a skilled job in Canada and a similar position in India can be large enough to completely transform the standard of living for an entire family. There's another factor that often goes unnoticed, yet it has played a major role in making Indians one of the immigrant groups best positioned to take advantage of the opportunities Canada has to offer. Interestingly, this advantage began to take shape more than a century ago, during the period when the British Empire ruled the Indian subcontinent. Although that colonial past left deep political and social consequences, it also influenced one aspect that today makes a tremendous difference for anyone hoping to build a life in an English-speaking country: proficiency in the English language. India is a country of continental scale, home to hundreds of different languages and dialects. In many regions, two people from different states may not even share the same native language. In that environment, English gradually became an important common language, especially in higher education, business, technology, and public administration. As a result, millions of Indian students spend years studying, writing academic papers, and even building their careers using English on a daily basis. Of course, not everyone in India speaks English fluently. The reality varies significantly between urban and rural areas, from one state to another, and across different levels of education. However, among the very people most likely to pursue opportunities abroad, university graduates, skilled professionals, and students hoping to immigrate, English proficiency tends to be much higher, and that gives them a significant advantage compared to applicants from many other countries. To understand why this matters so much, just consider the immigration process itself. Before even obtaining a visa, applicants are typically required to prove their English proficiency through internationally recognized language exams. If approved, they must then attend classes at Canadian colleges or universities, participate in job interviews, prepare professional resumes, communicate with employers, and quickly adapt to an English-speaking workplace. At nearly every stage of that journey, speaking English is not simply an advantage, it is essential. While many immigrants spend months or even years learning the language before they can compete on equal footing, a significant number of Indian applicants arrive with much of that challenge already behind them. That reduces the difficulties of adapting to life in Canada, makes communication easier from the very first day, and greatly increases their chances of finding employment more quickly. When it comes to immigration, one question seems inevitable. If the goal is to build a better life, earn more money, and find greater opportunities, why do so many Indians choose Canada instead of the United States? After all, the United States has the largest economy in the world, is home to some of the world's most valuable companies, and often offers salaries that are even higher than those in Canada. At first glance, it would seem like the obvious choice. But in reality, the decision made by millions of immigrants involves far more than just the size of a paycheck. For those who simply want to work abroad for a few years, the United States remains an extremely attractive destination. The challenge begins when the goal shifts from temporary employment to building a permanent life. Buying a home, bringing your family, enrolling your children in school, and eventually becoming a citizen all require long-term legal stability. And this is precisely where Canada has built one of its greatest competitive advantages. For decades, the Canadian government has developed a relatively transparent immigration system based on objective criteria. Instead of relying primarily on lotteries, employer sponsorships, or years of uncertainty, many immigration pathways use a points-based system. Factors such as age, education, professional experience, English or French language proficiency, and other qualifications increase an applicant's chances of receiving an invitation to apply for permanent residency. This means that, before they even pack their bags, many applicants already have a clear understanding of the requirements they need to meet in order to maximize their chances of staying in the country. In the United States, the situation is often very different. Many skilled professionals depend on temporary work visas, such as the H-1B visa, which are limited in number and highly competitive. On top of that, obtaining a green card can be a long and complicated process, especially for citizens of high-demand countries like India. In certain employment-based immigration categories, waiting times can stretch for many years, and in some cases exceed an entire decade because of annual per-country limits. During that time, many families live with significant uncertainty, never knowing exactly when, or even if, they will be able to obtain permanent residency. That difference completely changes the way many people plan their future. Imagine spending years studying, securing a job in another country, and still having no guarantee that you will be allowed to remain there permanently. For anyone hoping to build a long-term future, that uncertainty becomes one of the most important factors in deciding where to immigrate. For many years, immigration was presented as a solution to one of Canada's biggest challenges: a shrinking workforce and an aging population. And in many ways, it succeeded. It helped fill labor shortages across multiple industries, boosted consumer spending, and kept the country's economy growing during a critical period. But over the past few years, one important reality has become increasingly difficult to ignore. When a country's population grows much faster than its infrastructure can keep up, new problems inevitably begin to emerge, and that is exactly what happened in many parts of Canada. The first major impact appeared where almost everyone feels it the most: housing. For years, Canada welcomed hundreds of thousands of new residents while the construction of homes and apartment buildings failed to keep pace. The result was a widening gap between supply and demand. More and more people were searching for places to live, but there simply were not enough homes available. That imbalance caused housing costs to soar. In cities such as Toronto, Vancouver, and other major metropolitan areas, finding an apartment to rent became extremely difficult. Many rental listings attracted dozens of applicants within just a few days. In some cases, people began sharing small apartments with several roommates simply to afford the rent. For international students and newly arrived workers, the situation became even more challenging, but longtime Canadian residents also began feeling the impact in a significant way. Another consequence soon became visible in the labor market, especially for entry-level jobs. Industries such as restaurants, supermarkets, coffee shops, distribution centers, and delivery services started receiving far more applications for the same positions than they had in previous years. For jobs requiring little experience or specialized training, competition increased substantially in many cities. At the same time, employers suddenly had access to a much larger pool of available workers. That does not mean every worker lost opportunities or that wages declined across every industry. In highly skilled fields such as technology, engineering, and healthcare, demand for qualified professionals remained strong. However, for lower skilled positions, many people found that getting hired had become noticeably more difficult than it had been just a few years earlier, particularly in areas that experienced rapid population growth over a relatively short period. Perhaps the most visible impact for people living in Canada, however, has been the growing pressure on urban infrastructure. Heavier traffic, more crowded public transportation, and longer commute times have become part of everyday life for millions of residents. During rush hour, buses, subways, and commuter trains frequently operate close to their maximum capacity in several metropolitan regions. Public services have also come under increasing strain. Hospitals have experienced higher demand for medical care, while clinics and healthcare facilities have seen longer waiting times in many communities. Schools have had to accommodate growing numbers of students. Municipal services have been required to serve larger populations, and provincial governments have increasingly debated how to expand housing, transportation, healthcare, and other essential infrastructure quickly enough to keep pace with the country's unprecedented population growth. For many years, Canada's strategy seemed straightforward: increase immigration to strengthen the economy, offset the effects of an aging population, and fill thousands of job vacancies that remained unfilled. But as the consequences of that rapid population growth became increasingly visible in everyday life, the government found itself facing a difficult challenge. For the first time in decades, the question was no longer simply how to attract more immigrants. Instead, the debate shifted to something much more fundamental. Was the country growing faster than it could realistically prepare for? This change in public perception did not happen overnight. It developed gradually as rising housing costs, the shortage of available apartments, and growing pressure on hospitals, schools, and public transportation began dominating political discussions and newspaper headlines. At the same time, public opinion surveys showed that an increasing number of Canadians supported revising the country's immigration policies, not necessarily because they opposed immigration itself, but because they believed population growth needed to be better aligned with Canada's ability to expand its infrastructure and public services. It was in this context that the Canadian government began announcing a series of significant changes to its immigration policies. The stated goal was not to close the country's doors to newcomers, but to slow the growth of the temporary resident population, while federal, provincial, and municipal governments worked to increase the housing supply and strengthen essential public services. One of the first areas affected was the international student system. For years, Canada had become one of the world's most popular destinations for students from around the globe, particularly from India. Many educational institutions came to rely heavily on the tuition fees paid by international students, and several immigration pathways used higher education as a stepping stone into the Canadian workforce. However, the extremely rapid expansion of this model raised growing concerns about its long-term sustainability. In response, the government introduced limits on the number of new study permits issued, reducing approvals compared to previous years. The goal was to slow the flow of international students, particularly in regions where demand for housing had already exceeded available supply. Another significant change involved work permits for the spouses and family members of international students and temporary foreign workers. Under some immigration programs, spouses who had previously been eligible for relatively broad open work permits became subject to stricter eligibility requirements. According to the government, these changes were designed to better manage the growth of the temporary resident population while reducing pressure on the labor market, housing, and public services.